Our scripture reading this morning is taken from the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. Whew. From Jonah, chapter 1, 17 through chapter 2, verse 10. But the Lord provided a large fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. How shall I look again upon your holy temple? The waters closed in over me. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. At the roots of the mountains, I went down to the land, whose bars closed me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit. O Lord my God, as my life was ebbing away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who worship vain idols forsake their true loyalty. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. Then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out onto the dry land. This is the word of God.
Morning again. This morning, we have before us one of the most beautiful and significant prayers ever prayed by a prophet. Jonah, having been cast overboard for the safety and the sake of the sailors who were carrying him across, as you might remember from last week, across the sea to the cushy life in Tarshish. They cast him overboard, and he is swallowed by this great fish that we are told God provided. And in his distress, he finally prays. In fact, if you're reading this little book very carefully or listening to the story carefully, we've been waiting for Jonah to pray. To pray when God's call on his life seemed too steep. Why didn't he just pray? To pray when the seas became rough. To pray at least before the Gentile sailors who are carrying him across to Tarshish prayed. But by the time we've reached our text, they've actually already prayed, worshiped, made sacrifices and vows to Jonah's God. They are now converts to Yahweh. Last week we learned that we can't be better than Jonah because the truth is we're already too much like Jonah. And we're learning as we journey with Jonah that God's mission is completely sovereign. It is unchanging. It is independent of our choices. God is pursuing us, and God pursues this beloved world, whether we're on board with the plan or not. And now we have this prayer that's been shaped by God's own providence, the prayer of Jonah, son of Amittai, God's beloved dove, who is the son of truth. And it's a prayer that helps us not only to understand our predicament as people in this world, but it helps us to further understand God's compassion, which is the whole point of this book. So let's pray and then look at chapter 2. God in heaven, we give you thanks for this, your word. We give you thanks for the gift of prayer. We give you thanks that no matter the distance, you hear our prayers. So be with us and hear this prayer this morning that we might be shaped and formed by this, the reading of your word. In Jesus' name, amen. The first thing you might notice about our reading this morning is that we began at the end of chapter 1 rather than the beginning of chapter 2. The way Jonah reads is that you're supposed to have these long pauses. And the verses and the chapter numbers are not helping us to do this morning. So we started really where the story is supposed to have this pause. The story is meant to leave us hanging with sailors, Gentile sailors, who are now worshiping Yahweh, and Jonah, who's been cast overboard to drown. We're meant to wonder at the end of chapter 1, verse 16, is this the end? Is this where you would roll the credits? And we could imagine when this story was told, because first of all, it was told before it was written, that there was a long pause at what we call chapter 1, verse 16. And this wouldn't have been a bad ending or even an unexpected ending. This wayward prophet ends up inadvertently, accidentally converting this group of Gentile sailors to Yahweh, and then he's cast overboard to meet his end. If a part of the point of the Jonah story is that God has compassion on those outside of the church and works their salvation through the work of the church, through even broken church folks like Jonah, even when the church is acting against God's own wishes and will, God works anyways, this would be a pretty good ending to that story. And of course that Jonah kind of gets what's coming to him, right? He's cast overboard. It would work really well as a cautionary tale. We'd sit back thinking, we'd go, oh, I get it. God's ways and God's purposes are bigger than my ways. They're bigger than my purposes. God's ways and purposes are stronger than mine. And God chooses to work all things for good, even when I'm choosing not to. God's going to convert Gentile sailors, even though I never intended that in the first place. It's a good story. But then after the long pause, we hear, but the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. It's not the end. The story continues, and God, again, is the one that moves it forward. And we wonder, where will it go from here? How far can God's compassion reach? Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God, from the belly of the fish. And we go, finally he prays. What we were kind of hoping and expecting a prophet of God would have done a while ago, on the boat, in the storm, at the initial calling to Nineveh, before letting things get so out of hand, we would have thought he would have prayed. But again, how many of us have let things get so out of hand before we even think to pray? But prayer is something that we believe would put an end to a storm, right? All kinds of storms. But here's Jonah. He refuses to pray even up to his own death. And now in that death, Jonah, now he's finally ready to pray. He prays, I called out to the Lord in my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol, I cried, and you, God, heard my voice. It's this descending pattern that Jonah is describing here in the circumstance. He's describing his circumstance in the form of prayer. It's as though the reality of his situation as he's there 3 days and the fish starts to sink in finally. And first it is his literal circumstance, the belly of this fish. That's where he is. But then this prayer from his distress, right? That's his emotional circumstance. That's his psychological circumstance. But then finally he goes to his truest circumstance. He says, from the belly of Sheol. This is now his spiritual circumstance. You see, Jonah's truest circumstance is not really the fish, and it's not really what he feels about that or what he thinks about that. The real disaster of this self-made circumstance is this distance he's created between himself and God. It's his spiritual circumstance. And it's a distance as far as death. He's not just inside of this fish, he is in the Hebrew place of the dead, called Sheol. He's in the pit. And in fact, it would appear he actually goes much further away from God even than that. You'll notice too that Jonah's prayer begins kind of at the end, that the Hebrew mindset and the Christian mindset as well is always looking forward. We're always looking forward to what we believe God has already done in the future. That's kind of a weird way to look at things, but we're always looking forward to what we believe God has already done in the future. And so we see the end of things first. And what this is it's a truth and a confidence. It refuses to let go of the idea that God can reach us, God can hear us, God will deliver us, God will rescue, and it's so certain it's as though it's already happened. For the original audience of the Jonah story, they are all in exile when this story kind of starts to circulate. And so they're singing the songs of Zion by the waters of Babylon. They're displaced. And we have to keep in mind that people don't typically return from exile. That's very unusual. Once your group and your group's identity is absorbed into a bigger, more powerful group, you don't typically get your group identity back. What happens is you sink further and further into that more powerful group until the death of your culture, the death of your language usually, your religion, your beliefs, your everything, the life you knew before disappears to the point where nobody remembers it anymore. This is one of the biggest and, of course, valid criticisms of how we did missions for so long, right? Because no one comes back from exile. You can't get back what was lost. No one comes back from exile except Israel. Israel, so far as I know, stands near to alone in history as a nation and a faith and a culture and a people that somehow, some way, I don't even know how they do it, they do return, not from exile, they return from their exiles. And so here, even in exile, all the Psalms, all the prayers, all the songs from that time, they read as though God has already delivered them. They read in the past tense what they're predicting for the future. They're just that certain of it. For Christians, when we do this, we might look to the book of Revelation, or we more often look to the way that Paul will often speak as though the end has already happened. And so we too were called to carry on this tradition of confidence, as though God's final once and for all deliverance. It's so sure, it's so certain, it has already happened. We're just living into it. Jonah goes on, he says, You, God, cast me into the deep and into the heart of the sea. The flood surrounded me, and your waves, God, and your billows, they passed over me. We will forget how far what we call sin, just like with Jonah here, our own turning away. Just like Jonah's turning away, he just bolted from the presence of the temple. And we go running the other direction, and we forget that this behavior of running away from God, it actually makes us enemies of God. And we have a really hard time with that reality, that our brokenness makes us much more a friend to the enemy than to God. And while we can usually see this, I can see this a little bit more clearly than I can for myself. We can usually see this for people outside of ourselves, right? It's so easy for us to identify how the world has gone wrong because of them over there, or that group, or this group. But we have such a hard time seeing this within ourselves. Jesus says it's so hard for us to see, we actually have to die to it. We have to die to that self. In other words, we have to let our ego die. And that's really hard work, and it is absolutely no fun. But Jonah reminds us who our adversary is when we defy God, when we tuck tail and run the other direction. He says, we are now God's adversaries. And so God starts to act adversarial. So in his prayer, he says, you're the one that sent me into the deep. You did this. God hurled that wind at Jonah's boat. God orchestrated the salvation of those sailors. God provided Jonah's salvation in the form of this giant fish. It's not the choicest way to be saved. And now God casts Jonah into the deep. In Jonah's time, the sea, especially the deep sea, was seen as chaos. This fish that God provides would actually be seen as a chaos monster, these beings that could exist in kind of the chaotic primordial soup. So the ocean then, the deep ocean especially, it represents God's opposite. God creates order in this world. The sea is the chaos that God separates at creation. When he separates, it says the waters from the waters to bring about order. And Jonah describes in detail all that the waters of chaos are doing to him. He's at the heart of the chaos. The chaos surrounds him. The chaos pushes him further and further down. There is no further place from God in the minds of early Hebrew people than the chaos of the deep. And here Jonah is in the belly of this chaos monster, and he's being transported deeper and deeper and further away and away until he just disappears. So Jonah pleads with God, I am driven away from your sight. How shall I look again upon your holy temple, where your presence is? Jonah, who last week turned his back on God without a word, without a prayer, just ran, he now grieves the consequences. If he goes down into the depths any deeper, how is he ever going to turn back? There's simply no hope of being saved. That the further Jonah sinks into the chaos, the further he is away from God's presence. So Jonah's prayer paints a picture for us of these two opposites, the chaotic deep and the temple. This poem and this prayer, for any Jewish person of Jonah's day, reading this or listening to this told as a story, this would be scary to them. And this would be hard to hear. Jonah is now so much further from God in the temple than he was in chapter 1. He's further than we can really even imagine. And then it just gets even worse. He says, weeds were then wrapped around my head. I was at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. As Jonah is describing this kind of descent, as he goes further and further down, I think it's hard for us in modernity to imagine what he's talking about here. But he's speaking from a pre-modern kind of mindset and the ancient way that Judaism and actually many other religions viewed how the world worked, right? You see, we read in Genesis that God separates the waters, the deep from the deep, this kind of primordial chaos of nothingness. And then he separates the waters, and then God creates the ocean and the land in between the space of separation. So above the blue skies that we see every day, in their minds, was the primordial chaos, the sea. And then below the ocean and below all that was just more chaos. And Rachel actually has a slide here that I hope can illustrate this for us. Rachel, can you pull that up? And I don't know how well you can see that, but you've got, heaven of the heavens, you got ocean of heaven, you got firmament. This is creation in the in-between space. There's Sheol, the dark space down there. And then there's kind of these pillars that are going down. How far down do the pillars go? Don't ask. There's actually a great Greek myth to illustrate the point of this kind of worldview, but a wise sage once said that the world was created on the back of a turtle. And one of his young students asked, well, what's below the turtle? And he said, well, it's another turtle. Well, what's below that one? He said, well, it's another turtle. And he said, well, what's below that turtle? Another turtle? And the wise teacher says, yes, it's turtles all the way down. So, That's such a funny joke in philosophy classes, by the way. Well, in the Hebrew world, as you can kind of, I hope, see a little bit of here, everything's resting on these pillars, and it's kind of pillars all the way down. But what Jonah is describing here is this place that's actually, it's beyond death. It's further down than even the underworld. It's further down than Sheol. Jonah describes that he's gone down below the land, below the ocean, to the primordial chaotic waters that exist beyond, and the bars are closed behind him forever. The gates are shut. And what Jonah is describing is a separation from God and a distance from God that's really like none other in the Bible. No one else in the Bible describes themselves as being this far separated from God. It's an utterly hopeless distance from which there can be no return. It's just too far, it's too deep, and even the bars are locked shut behind him. Thanks, Rachel. Yet Jonah prays, "You brought my life up from the pit. O Lord my God, as my life was ebbing away, I called you to mind. I thought of you. And my prayer from where I am came to you, into your holy temple." What he means there is the Holy of Holies, where God's presence is most present. All that distance he is from God, and God still hears his prayer. I think we can take for granted, and I think we can often have a hard time just even conceptualizing the distance God comes to us for our sake, for our salvation. The distance God will go and does go to pull us up out of the pit, out of the pit of our choices, out of the pit of the things we didn't choose, but they still have a hold of us. We can't even fathom the distance God travels, will travel, does travel to rescue us from these places, from the deep. We can't hardly imagine how our sin separates us from him. It's hard for us to die enough to the ego to really wrestle with that. And yet how God hears our cries, even from those places we would think it's impossible for God to hear me from here in this place. I hear from people sometimes that either they or maybe their circumstance, it's too far gone. They've drifted from God's ways in such a way they think, I could never return. Or my life, it's whatever's happening to me won't allow for that. It's too deep of a dark place. And it's spun too far out of control for God to even hear me. And I hear people say this, and I almost always immediately think of Jonah. Jonah, who says to us, I just called God to mind. I just thought of him. And in an instant, from the depths of chaos beyond the reaches of even death, there was my prayer in the presence of God. He's not even praying, I'm sorry for all of this yet. It's already there. Even from beyond the reaches of the furthest place we can possibly imagine, God hears our prayers. So Jonah closes, those who worship vain idols forsake their true loyalty. But I, with a voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will pay. In other words, I'll do what you asked me to do. Because deliverance belongs to the Lord. The Hebrew here, those who worship vain idols forsake their true loyalty. It actually reads much more like, those who worship the vapor and the mist. They forsake their loving kindness. Those who worship the vapor and the mist forsake their loving kindness. In other words, chasing after anything other than God in this life or the next, apparently, is like chasing after nothing at all. It's chasing after a vapor, a mist. And Jonah confesses, I've been chasing after an illusion. The illusion of my ego, the illusion of the cushy life there in Tarshish. And in doing this, he's forsaken his true loyalty, his own self, his own loving kindness, which of course should be coming from this first priority. The source of all loving kindness is God. This morning, if you're breathing, how many? A couple of us, okay. Some of us are chasing vapor and mist. To some degree or another, I think we all are. We're after the illusion of a better Tarshish life, or we're caught up in the illusions of our own egos, of our own self. This morning, I think all of us have a hard time understanding just how far God comes to rescue us. And I do think we end up kind of on a day-to-day take our salvation for granted. We don't see that the pit of chaos in Jonah is actually the human predicament for all of us. It's hard for us to see our lives as being that in need of saving when we live in a culture of comparison, and we can always say, well, that other person over there, they're worse off than I am, so I must be doing okay. This morning, some of us, depending on the degree to which you're experiencing this, some of us are in the belly of the fish. Some of us know exactly what it means to be inside a chaos monster. Right now, everything's spinning out of control. And we just feel like we're sinking deeper and deeper, and we're thinking to ourselves, how could God ever rescue me from this pit? Some of us, like Jonah, suffer from this tendency. The last thing we think to do in those circumstances is pray. And this is one of the most amazing things about this little tiny book called Jonah. God provided the fish to swallow him. It's the strangest rescue plan I've ever heard of. And then from the belly of this fish that God provided, from this place of distress and from the heart of the pit, we get this beautiful prayer that speaks to all of us, no matter where we're at. If you think you've got a better plan for an easier life, then the book of Jonah says to us, nope, you are chasing after mist. If you think you are okay and not so bad off, or at least not as bad off as that other person, Jonah says, nope, all of us have turned our back. Paul says that this way, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory. And on the flip side of that, if you think you're so bad off that you are beyond saving, the book of Jonah says in his prayer, nope. This God goes beyond the borders of anything and everything just to get to you. And even the moment you turn your mind to this God, that is the moment that your prayers are before him. So the question becomes out of Jonah chapter 2 and this prayer is, how can we turn our mind and our hearts and our attention to God in prayer? Why don't we start by praying together now?